Hi guys. Tonight, we're getting ready for a night you wouldn't wish on even the person you dislike most. If you're already feeling the chills, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you like what I do. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time of day it is for you right now. If you don't mind, feel free to leave a comment and let me know. Imagine yourself trudging through the narrow streets of the Middle Ages. Imagine yourself trudging across a medieval field. Snow crunching beneath your boots. Every breath fogging in front of your face like a small ghost. Your shoulders ache beneath armor that has already absorbed far too much cold and your fingers twitch in their stiff leather gloves. The camp lies ahead. A cluster of flickering lights and the faint smell of woodsome smoke. And you know you're only minutes away from the one place where a soldier could collapse after marching all day. That's right, the tent. But before we crawl inside, let me give you the friendly reminder that honestly, you probably wouldn't survive this night outdoors without some very serious luck. The human body is not made for hours of sub-zero shivering while wrapped only in scratchy wool. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post your location and local time down in the comments. I always find it fascinating to know when and where you're listening from. Now dim the lights and step forward into this world. You reach the camp, and the glow of firelight feels like a fragile promise. A medieval army on the move carried tents, yes, but those tents were nothing like your modern waterproof nylon cocoon. They were bulky canvas or heavy linen stretched over wooden poles, sometimes patched with leather. You duck inside and the smell of damp wool, smoke, and tired bodies immediately hits you. The tent is low, so you have to crouch. Your armor cracks as you lower yourself onto the ground, which feels half frozen, half mud, depending on whether it snowed or rained earlier. One mainstream fact to keep in mind is that medieval campaigns often ran into late autumn or even the heart of winter. Not because generals enjoyed punishing their men, but because wars rarely respected weather calendars. Chroniclers from the 100 Years' War mention soldiers digging in through December, canvas tents sagging under ice. And it wasn't just Northern Europe. Armies in the Balkans or on the steppes faced brutal nights where the wind could snap tent ropes like string. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some medieval soldiers swore that their best insulation came not from the cloth above them, but from what they piled beneath branches, hay, even the remains of battlefield shields stacked flat to lift them off the frozen ground. Think of it like the medieval version of a camping pad. A night squire might lay down cut rushes in a neat layer, while common soldiers scrambled for any dry bundle they could stuff under their cloaks. But here's where historians still debate. Just how effective were these tents at keeping men alive through a real winter's night? Some records suggest the canvas was so thin that snow blew straight through the seams, soaking soldiers until they had to huddle outside by the fire instead. Others argue that with enough layering of hides and cloaks, a tent provided a surprising amount of insulation, especially when packed tightly with men shoulder to shoulder. It's the classic academic tug-of-war. Were these shelters mere symbols of order or genuine lifesavers against frostbite? You sit in the dim glow, hearing the muffled voices of comrades settling down around you. The wind claws at the canvas walls, each gust making the ropes creak and the stakes groan in the earth. You can feel the draft swirling across the floor, chilling your ankles. Someone beside you coughs deep and rattling, and you know sickness spreads faster than warmth here. Still, the tent is better than open air. You stretch out, cloak pulled over your shoulders, armor stacked awkwardly near your head as a pillow. Imagine the sensations, the smoky tang from the fire outside, still clinging to your cloak, the musty damp of canvas pressing into your nostrils, the scratch of straw through thin fabric beneath your cheek. You close your eyes, but sleep feels like a stubborn mule. You toss, you shiver, you pull the cloak tighter, all while the cold seeps in like water through cracks. Somewhere outside, a guard calls out the hour. Another night in the medieval camp has only just begun. You shift in your place, blinking in the dim light, and realize that the tent itself is both your sanctuary and your tormentor. The walls rise up only a few feet, sagging inward where snow has gathered on the canvas. Your breath lingers in the stale air, drifting toward the roof, where smoke stains reveal how often fires or lanterns have blackened the fabric. You run your hand along the surface. It feels coarse, rough, and damp from condensation. There is no waterproof coating, no clever seam tape. Instead, the whole structure is simply a shell against the wind. Flimsy yet oddly comforting because it's the only barrier you have. One plain historical fact is that medieval military tents were not luxuries but logistics. Commanders carried them on long trains of carts, each pole and canvas bundle weighing dozens of pounds. Nobles claimed the larger pavilion-style tents brightly dyed, sometimes even embroidered to mark their rank. Common foot soldiers made do with smaller, plainer shelters, the kind that could barely hold 3 men huddled in the dark. The difference was as sharp as night and day, and yet even the smallest scrap of canvas felt like a fortress when winter pressed its claws against you. Now for a more curious detail. Soldiers sometimes stuffed bits of animal fat or beeswax into the seams of their tents, hoping to repel rain and snow. The result? A faint greasy smell clung to the fabric, mixing with smoke, making the whole interior smell like a butcher's stall. It wasn't exactly pleasant, but imagine the relief when a snowstorm pounded down outside and the drops rolled off instead of soaking your blanket. Soldiers were practical creatures. They would take stench over frostbite any night. And yet, historians remain divided about whether these makeshift shelters were sufficient in the long run. Some argue that tents offered little more than psychological comfort. A roof that tricked soldiers into thinking they were safe while sickness crept in anyway. Others suggest the communal aspect, dozens of men packed tightly inside, created a pocket of body heat, strong enough to keep temperatures tolerable. Without thermometers, without measurements, all we have are chronicles laced with exaggeration. Did soldiers really sleep soundly? Or was that just a scribe smoothing over the misery? That question lingers like the draft crawling under your ankles. You crouch lower, pulling your cloak tighter, and glance at the makeshift furnishings. There's not much. A battered wooden chest serves as a stool for someone. A tangle of shields and spears leans in the corner, taking up the dry spot where you wish you could stretch your legs. The canvas rustles like a drum whenever the wind smacks it, and droplets of melted frost patter onto your gear. You curl further inward, shoulders hunched, trying to imagine warmth where there is none. The sounds around you are strangely intimate. A companion snores already, heavy and wet. Another mutters under his breath. Perhaps a prayer. Perhaps a curse. Someone coughs again. The noise sharp and ragged. Your own stomach growls, echoing softly in the dark. Outside, the muffled pop of burning wood carries through, and with it the faint smell of smoke that seeps into every fiber of your cloak. The tent is alive with sensations. Clammy air, prickling skin, the constant low hum of breath and shifting bodies. For a moment, you close your eyes and imagine how fragile this fabric really is. One spark from a torch could reduce the whole structure to a pile of ash. One gale of wind could rip it from the stakes and send it tumbling across the camp. And yet, as you breathe in the stale air and listen to the low chorus of weary men, you also realize this is survival. Primitive and perfect survival none. The tent with all its flaws is what stands between you and the endless black cold beyond its canvas walls. You tug the cloak closer to your body and feel the rough fibers scratch your chin. It isn't glamorous, not even remotely, but the cloak is more than just clothing now. It's your mattress, your blanket, and your shield all at once. Wool is heavy, coarse, and faintly itchy, but it is also the one material that stubbornly clings to warmth even when damp. You lie back, rolling the edges around your shoulders like a cocoon, and realize this single garment might mean the difference between a night's rest and a shivering ordeal until dawn. One solid historical fact is that medieval soldiers relied heavily on cloaks, not only for marching but also for sleeping. Chroniclers often describe soldiers lying down wrapped in their cloaks, especially in campaigns where carrying extra bedding was impractical. Even high-ranking men, when forced into long campaigns, sometimes dispensed with mattresses and sheets, depending on their cloaks' layered folds to serve as their bedding. It was a universal tool, clothing by day, bedding by night. Here's a peculiar little detail. Some cloaks were so thick and oily from repeated wear that they developed a natural water resistance, almost like the wax jackets you might see today. Soldiers joked that their cloaks could stand upright on their own if left in the corner. It wasn't just dirt. It was months of sweat, fat, spilled ale, and maybe a bit of mutton grease rubbed in. Disgusting. Sure. Effective against drizzle or snow melt. Surprisingly, yes. The cloak became a sort of accidental waterproof top, a second skin that aged like a strange smelly armor. Of course, scholars disagree over how much comfort these cloaks actually provided in freezing temperatures. Some argue that the thickness of wool cloaks genuinely offered insulation comparable to a blanket. Others counter that without layers beneath like straw or furs, soldiers wrapped in cloaks alone still lost body heat to the icy ground beneath them. Was the cloak a true safeguard or merely a thin excuse against nature's bite? Accounts vary, and perhaps the truth lies somewhere in the middle. You shuffle against the ground, feeling the hard lumps of frozen earth beneath you. The cloak dulls some of the sting, but every bone still aches as though the soil itself is pressing upward. You curl into a tighter ball, tucking your knees against your chest, because that's the way warmth hides best, compressed, hoarded, conserved around you. Others do the same. Shapes under woolen folds become indistinguishable. Men become bundles of fabric with only the occasional cough or murmur to prove they're still alive. The air is thick with dampness. When you exhale, your breath condenses on the inside of your cloak, turning the fabric clammy. You press your face against the folds anyway, inhaling the faint scent of lanolin and smoke. It's not pleasant, but it's home for tonight. Someone shifts beside you, their cloak brushing against yours, and for an instant the touch feels like a warm reassurance. Everyone here clings to their little island of wool, but together those islands form a crowded archipelago of survival. Picture the scene more closely. Cloaks in shades of brown, gray, and faded blue, edges ragged, hems stiff from old mud. Each one tells a story of battles fought, roads marched, and storms endured. They are blankets stitched with history, even if that history smells like sweat. And as you lie there cocooned in your own smelly scrap of wool, you realize that you're no different from thousands of soldiers before you. Cloaks kept them alive long enough to keep fighting. They will, you hope, keep you alive tonight. You roll onto your side, cloak clutched tightly, and instantly bump into another body. There's no privacy here. The tent is small and survival demands closeness. You hear the slow rhythm of breath, the rustle of wool against wool, and you feel the faint radiating heat from the man lying only inches away. You shuffle closer without even thinking about it, because warmth is a kind of currency, and the only way to get more is to share what little you already have. One straightforward fact is that medieval soldiers routinely slept in groups, pressed shoulder to shoulder, hip to hip, forming a human furnace. Chroniclers of the Crusades, for example, mention men lying in heaps like dogs to stave off cold desert nights. In the frozen forests of northern Europe, entire squads packed themselves into narrow tents, knowing that no one soldier could endure the chill alone. It was practical, not sentimental, the only insulation available when firewood was scarce and blankets were few. And here's a quirky little tidbit. In some armies, soldiers gave each other nicknames based on their sleeping habits. The one who snored too loudly might be called the bellows, while the man who tossed and kicked became the mule. These names stuck even outside the tent. A small reminder that hardship turned into humor whenever it could. After all, if you can't laugh at the misery of sleeping nose with an unwashed comrade, what else can you do? Yet historians still puzzle over whether this communal sleeping fostered camaraderie or bred resentment. Some argue it built bonds of brotherhood. Soldiers trusted each other more after enduring such intimacy. Others counter that constant proximity led to festering irritation, spreading lice and bad tempers more effectively than warmth. Did it pull men together or wear down their nerves? The sources leave the answer tangled in contradiction. As you shift in the dark, you notice how the heat feels uneven. Your side pressed against your comrade warms quickly while your exposed back chills like stone. So you roll again awkwardly and bump into someone else. Now you are wedged between two bodies, each one radiating a little warmth into your bones. It's uncomfortable, yes, but gradually your shivers ease. The smell is pungent. Sweat, smoke, leather, unwashed feet. But you accept it because you'd rather smell your neighbors than feel the knife edge of cold slicing through your ribs. The noises are constant. Someone snores like a saw rattling the canvas with each breath. Another coughs wetly into his sleeve. A muttered prayer drifts through the dark. You even hear a laugh, dry, soft, almost hysterical, as if one soldier finds the absurdity of this dog pile too much to bear. You close your eyes and let yourself sink into the rhythm of shared survival. Imagine the scene from above. A heap of cloaks and limbs tangled like a nest of hibernating animals. The canvas walls bulge slightly outward from the press of bodies inside. Outside, the wind claws at the ropes, but here in the thick of it, you're cushioned by living walls of flesh and fabric. You are not alone. Not tonight. Whether you like it or not, survival has turned you into part of a collective organism, breathing, sweating, shivering in imperfect harmony. You sigh, pressing your forehead against the rough wool of your neighbor's cloak. The warmth isn't enough to chase the cold entirely, but it dulls the ache in your bones. And as you drift toward a fitful rest, you realize this sleeping close. Sharing heat wasn't just a strategy. It was a necessity, a truth of survival in the medieval camp. You weren't meant to endure the night alone. The fire is the beating heart of the camp. You can hear it before you see it. The crackle, the low pop, the occasional hiss of damp wood. Step outside your tent flap and you find it there. A ring of embers pulsing red and orange. A few logs leaning against one another like old men holding each other up. The flames do not leap high. Not tonight. Instead, they crouch low, gnawing at whatever scraps the soldiers could gather. Twigs, branches, even bits of broken carts. Firewood is scarce, always scarce. Every man here knows that keeping the fire alive through the night is both salvation and danger. One solid historical fact is that medieval armies relied on campfires not only for cooking but also for sheer survival in winter. Fires were deliberately placed at the center of small groups of tents so the glow and warmth could radiate outward, however feebly, into the canvas walls. Archaeological digs of old encampments have revealed blackened soil patches and repeating circles, evidence of countless fires tended carefully through bitter campaigns. Without them, the cold would kill faster than swords. But here's the quirky detail that sneaks in. Men often tried to carry fire with them, literally. They would scoop up glowing embers into clay pots or even metal helmets, banking them under layers of ash so they could be rekindled at dawn without striking flint in frozen air. Imagine cradling a smoldering pot in your arms like a baby, trying not to burn yourself, yet knowing that this ember is your ticket to warmth tomorrow. Soldiers passed those glowing jars around like treasure, a kind of portable hearth on the march. And yet scholars still debate whether the danger outweighed the benefit. Fires inside or near tents risked sparks catching on canvas, especially since most medieval tents were coated in oily residues from smoke and grime. Some argue that commanders forbade open flames inside shelters altogether, forcing men to rely on body heat alone. Others believe small braziers were common, carefully placed and tended even within the thin walls. Was it widespread practice or just a desperate gamble by a few reckless souls? The written accounts contradict each other, leaving us with smoke but no clear flame. You sit by the fire now, your face warmed while your back remains icy. That's the cruel trick of fire. It never warms everything at once. You stretch your hands forward until your palms sting, then rub them quickly together. The light makes every crease of your skin glow red. Your cloak smells even smokier now. The wool saturated with ash that will cling for weeks. You tilt your boots closer, hoping to dry the mud, but careful not to scorch the leather. Around you, men mutter in low voices, the kind of half-asleep chatter that tumbles out when exhaustion has dulled every sharp thought. The fire crackles, sending sparks spiraling upward into the black sky. Each spark disappears like a star falling into nothing. Smoke curls into your nose, making your eyes water. And yet you lean closer still because the heat is life. Behind you, someone shifts in his cloak and groans. Another man stirs the embers with a stick, coaxing more glow from the collapsing logs. The fire demands constant attention like a hungry animal. If no one feeds it, it will sulk and die before dawn. Picture the strange rhythms this created in camp life. Soldiers rotated not just guard duty but also fire duty, stumbling out of tents to throw on another branch. You imagine the footsteps crunching in the snow. The quiet curses muttered as a man's bare hand brushes a hot ember. Sometimes a log collapses with a sharp crack, sending up a burst of light that briefly illuminates the tents, the horses, the pale outlines of exhausted faces. For a moment, the camp looks like a living painting, shadows dancing, breath steaming, eyes blinking in the glow. You can almost hear the fire speaking, a language of crackles and sighs. It tells you that warmth is fleeting, that survival is fragile, that every man huddled here is bound together by this fragile circle of light. The fire makes you drowsy too. The rhythm of it, the warmth on your face, the hypnotic glow that blurs the edges of everything, but you know you can't linger too long. If you fall asleep by the fire, you risk waking up in smoke or not at all. So you retreat again to your tent, bringing with you the ghost of heat. Your cloak still carries the warmth like a memory, though it fades quickly in the drafty dark. Inside, the men stir as you crawl back into your corner. You curl again, knees to chest, cloak wrapped tightly, imagining the embers glowing only a few feet away. That fragile light out there is what keeps the entire camp breathing. Without it, there would only be silence, snow, and the endless cold night swallowing everything whole. Now, think of the strange balance fire introduced to medieval soldiers. Too little fire and men froze. Too much fire and tents burned down. Add to that the lure of enemies spotting the glow from miles away, and commanders had to decide how much risk was worth taking. Fires might save you from frost, but they could also betray your position to a watchful scout. You picture the commanders weighing those choices, their faces shadowed, their voices low. Should they keep the fire blazing or let their men freeze quietly in the dark? The answer often depended on desperation. In some sieges, fires were forbidden entirely, the fear of detection greater than the fear of cold. Men huddled without light, gnawing at cold bread, cursing under their breath. In other campaigns, where survival trumped secrecy, entire camps blazed with dozens of fires, sending columns of smoke skyward like signals to the gods. Whichever choice was made, the fire shaped every soldier's night, every hour of restless sleep. Tonight, as you listen to the wind battering the canvas walls, you realize how much hope you've pinned on that crackling outside. The tent may be flimsy, the cloak itchy, the bodies pressed against yours smelly, but the fire is different. the fire feels alive. It is the only thing that answers back to the cold, the only thing that says, yes, you may survive this night after all. You close your eyes, letting the memory of its glow linger behind your eyelids, and drift into uneasy sleep while the embers hiss softly outside, guarding the camp with their fragile light. You wake in the middle of the night, and for a moment you don't know what has roused you. Then you feel it, the scratchy rasp against your cheek, the faint tickle across your arm. You shift slightly and realize that beneath you is not earth alone, but something rougher, heavier, and warmer. A pelt, animal skin laid down as a thin buffer between your body and the merciless ground. One straightforward fact is that soldiers across medieval Europe frequently relied on animal skins for bedding. Hides from sheep, goats, or even deer were spread across tent floors to provide some insulation. In wealthier armies, knights had furs, fox, wolf, or even beaver that softened the ground and trapped warmth. The poorer soldier made do with whatever scraps of hide he could scavenge, tanned or not, sometimes still carrying the sharp scent of animal fat. Archaeological finds from temporary camps have turned up leather fragments hardened by time, remnants of these once essential sleeping tools. And here's a curious tidbit. In particularly harsh campaigns, soldiers were known to strip skins from freshly slaughtered animals and sleep on them while still steaming with body heat. Imagine the awkwardness of lying down on a half-warm, half-bloody hide, trying to ignore the smell because you know it might save your toes from frostbite. Some chroniclers even joked about men borrowing warmth from the beasts they ate, as if dinner and bedding were two halves of the same animal. It was grisly, practical, and not something you'd want to explain to your laundress back home. But historians remain divided on just how widespread fur use really was. Some argue that pelts were luxuries accessible mostly to knights and commanders, the rank and file relying solely on straw or cloaks. Others point to records of soldiers being issued sheepskins as part of campaign supplies, suggesting that hides were common even for footmen. Was it a standard survival kit or just a fortunate accident when livestock was nearby? The sources leave us guessing like a fire sputtering low in the night. You shift again, pressing your palm flat against the hide. It feels coarse, the hairs prickling your skin, yet it does hold a certain warmth. Beneath it, the ground still radiates cold, but not as fiercely. The pelt is like a whisper of comfort, a reminder that you're not lying directly on frost and soil. You inhale, and the smell is earthy, musky, with a faint undertone of smoke where someone tried to dry it too quickly. It's not pleasant, but it anchors you. Around you, men shuffle in their sleep, cloaks rustling, bodies shifting. One pulls his pelt closer, curling onto it like a dog in a kennel. Another has none, and you hear his teeth chatter in the dark. You almost pity him. But in this world, pity is a dangerous luxury. You hold onto your scrap of hide tightly like it is treasure. Think of the tactile details, the greasy feel of half-tanned leather, the way the fur rubs against your cheek when you roll, the dampness that seeps through when snowmelt sneaks under the tent. You can almost feel the pelt stiffening over the days, clotted with dirt and sweat, yet still kept because there is no better alternative. Comfort is relative. Survival is absolute. The camp outside murmurs with the wind. The fire has dwindled, embers glowing faintly. The canvas above you trembles with each gust. You close your eyes again, cheek against the pelt, and wonder whether tomorrow you'll wake with its smell still clinging to you, or whether you'll wake at all. But for tonight, this scrap of an animal's past life keeps you from freezing into stillness. That is enough. You stir awake, and the first thing you notice is your feet. They feel swollen, numb at the toes, prickling with a dull ache that refuses to fade. You never took your boots off. Not last night, not the night before. You know why? If you did, you might never get them back on again. Frozen leather, stiff as wood, laces crusted with ice, toes too swollen to squeeze inside. So you leave them on, always on, sleeping in the same boots you march in. One undeniable fact: medieval soldiers often slept with their boots still laced. Chroniclers describe men too afraid of frostbite or sudden attack to risk exposing bare feet. Boots, even crude ones of leather stitched with hobnails, provided not just protection from terrain, but also a barrier against the night's cold. Removing them in freezing conditions could mean waking to find them frozen solid or your feet frostbitten beyond repair. Better to endure the stink and the ache than risk losing toes to the winter. Here's the quirky part. Soldiers sometimes stuffed straw, moss, or even bits of wool into their boots as insulation, layering the insides like primitive socks. The result: boots bulged awkwardly, squeaked when they walked, and reeked of damp rot, but they trapped just enough heat to keep frostbite at bay. Some men even swore that grease, yes, animal fat smeared inside, helped seal out the cold. Imagine slipping your feet into that inky, greasy mess and calling it comfort. Strange, yes, but in desperation, practicality always outweighs dignity. Of course, scholars still wrestle with the question of whether this practice was sustainable. Some argue that constantly wearing boots worsened trench foot-like conditions centuries before trenches existed, feet swollen, blistered, and raw from lack of air. Others suggest soldiers simply rotated footwear, drying one pair by the fire while wearing another, though this assumes an abundance of boots that poorer soldiers likely never had. Was perpetual boot wear a universal misery or a burden mostly for the lower ranks? The evidence remains patchy, like a half-tanned hide. You wiggle your toes trying to coax life back into them and feel the hardened leather resist. Your socks, if you can call the damp wool wraps that are clammy, stiff with sweat. The stench wafts upward, pungent and sour, mingling with smoke and unwashed bodies. Everyone smells the same though, so no one bothers to complain. You press your boots closer to the fading warmth of the fire, hoping the leather softens a little. The heat sears your soles for an instant, then fades around you. Others do the same. Boots crowd the edge of the embers like offerings to some strange god. One man mutters that his heel feels black. Another curses the blister on his arch. A third laughs, claiming he'll sell his boots for a warm bath if such a miracle ever appears. You chuckle faintly too, because what else can you do? The boots may be prisons, but they are also lifelines. Without them you'd lose more than comfort. You'd lose the ability to march, to fight, to survive. Picture the sounds of this scene. The creak of stiff leather, the snapping of half-rotted laces, the groans as men tug their boots off only to shove them back on minutes later. You can almost hear the squelch of damp wool, the hiss when a too close boot sole scorches by the fire. The whole tent smells of wet leather, a sharp tang that seeps into cloaks and hair alike. It's unpleasant, but in this frozen camp, unpleasantness is far preferable to frostbitten silence. You settle back down, boots still laced tight, toes crammed together like unwilling neighbors. The leather presses against your ankles, digging into sore skin, but you accept it. The choice is simple: comfort for a few hours or survival for another day. You let your eyes drift closed, your feet still encased, and you understand why medieval soldiers never truly took their boots off. They carried their survival with them. Step by step, night by night, until morning came again. Your breath fogs in the tent's stale air, and you reach for the flask at your side. The liquid sloshes quietly, heavy with promise. You tip it back and the burn spreads down your throat, chasing away the shivers for a moment. Me, or maybe something harsher distilled by local hands, it doesn't matter. In this cold, soldiers call it medicine, and for a few blissful minutes you believe them. One historical fact is that alcohol was a staple in medieval camps, issued not just for cheer but for necessity. Wine diluted with water, weak ale, or whatever fermented drink was on hand became safer than drinking unclean water. On freezing nights, soldiers turned to it as a crude antifreeze, numbing both body and mind enough to let sleep take hold. Chroniclers describe men fortifying their hearts with drink. a polite phrase for gulping down liquid warmth before collapsing in the dark. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some soldiers believed strong drink actually prevented frostbite, claiming it warmed the blood. They would rub spirits on their skin or even soak socks in ale before pulling them on, convinced the alcohol acted like a magical shield. Of course, it did no such thing, but belief alone gave comfort. Picture the absurdity. Staggering into your tent with socks dripping beer, smelling like a tavern floor, and still swearing you'd wake up toastier because of it. Yet historians still wrestle with the role alcohol played. Some argue it genuinely helped morale, keeping despair at bay during long campaigns. Others note that drunkenness left camps vulnerable, men too sluggish to respond to sudden attacks or fires. Was it a boon for survival or a liability disguised as warmth? The debate simmers like a pot over low embers, never quite boiling to certainty. You lower the flask, lips still tingling, and exhale. The warmth spreads unevenly. Your chest glows, but your fingers remain stiff, your toes still frozen in their boots. Around you, other men drink too. The soft glug of flasks punctuating the dark. One mutters a half-drunk song, voice cracking. Another chuckles dryly, wiping his mouth with a filthy sleeve. A third sigh deeply, leaning back against the canvas as though the drink alone has softened its rough walls. The tent fills with the scent of ale, sour, yeasty, faintly sweet that it mixes with smoke and sweat, creating an aroma that clings to cloaks and hair. You can almost taste it in the air as much as in the flask. It doesn't banish the cold entirely, but it tricks the body into believing warmth is possible. And that illusion is often all a soldier needs to drift into uneasy sleep. But there is danger in it too. You know that if you drink too much, your body will slacken, your vigilance fade, the fire outside could die, the guard could doze, enemies could slip close, and you'd never notice. More than one campaign has recorded tents set ablaze because men passed out with flasks in hand, embers falling where they shouldn't. The line between warmth and ruin is thin, blurred further by every swallow. You lean back, the drink humming softly in your veins. Your eyelids grow heavier, and the cold feels less sharp, as though someone dulled its edges with a knife. You know it's false, that your body is still losing heat, but you cling to the comfort anyway. You curl into your cloak, flask tucked against your chest, and close your eyes. For now the ale has done its work. It has given you the illusion of warmth, enough to let sleep come. The itch wakes you before the cold does. At first, it's just a little tickle at your neck, something you scratch half asleep, but then it spreads a crawling irritation at your scalp, a pinch behind your knee, the unmistakable bite at your waist where cloth meets skin. You groan softly, dragging your nails across the fabric of your tunic, knowing exactly what has joined you in this tent. What? One plain historical fact is that medieval soldiers lived with lice as constantly as they lived with their cloaks and swords. Chroniclers of the Crusades, the 30 Years' War, and even smaller regional campaigns describe armies so infested that men joked about their camp companions being as loyal as their brothers in arms. Clothing was rarely washed, water was scarce, and the warmth of packed tents made the perfect breeding ground. Here's a quirky detail you can't quite laugh at. Some soldiers gave their lice names. Imagine that. Sitting by a fire, scratching at your shirt, and declaring that the fat little parasite you've just picked off is Henry the Bold or Margaret the Persistent. It was gallows humor, a way to cope with the endless crawling and biting that never truly stopped. Some men even staged races, dropping lice on warm surfaces to see whose pest would scurry fastest. Boredom and misery bred strange games. But historians still argue about just how devastating lice were to the health of medieval armies. Some say infestations were a mere nuisance, unpleasant but survivable. Others point to the spread of diseases like typhus carried by lice that could decimate entire camps faster than enemy arrows. Were lice merely itchy bedfellows, or were they silent killers in wool and seams? The evidence leaves us scratching for answers. You shift on your cloak, fingers digging under your collar. The fabric is rough with grit and sweat, but beneath it you feel the tiny bumps where lice cling to seams. You pinch one, roll it between your fingertips until it pops faintly, and wipe your hand on the ground. Around you, other men do the same, scratching, muttering, cursing under their breath. The sound is constant, like the rustle of mice in dry straw. The smell in the tent is already sour with sweat and smoke, but add to that the faint iron tang of blood drawn by scratching, and you realize this discomfort has no cure tonight. Bathing isn't an option. Clean clothes don't exist. All you can do is endure the crawling sensation that keeps your skin twitching even as you try to sleep. Picture the misery more closely. A man wriggling against the ground, cloak shifting, muttering to himself as though fighting an invisible foe. Another lifts his shirt toward the firelight, squinting as he searches for the pale specks clinging like stubborn seeds. A third shakes out his woolen hood, sending a little shower of lice scattering like grains of sand. It is disgusting, yes, but it is also normal. So normal that no one even looks up from their scratching. You sigh, resigned, and tuck yourself deeper into your cloak, even though you know it only traps the pests closer to your skin. The itch will not let you rest easily, but exhaustion wins over discomfort. Your eyes close again, and the crawling becomes part of the background hum of camp life. Like the creak of canvas, the cough of a neighbor, the hiss of wind outside. In the medieval soldier's world, even parasites were part of survival. The scratching fades into the background, and eventually you hear a different sound. Low voices, muffled footsteps, the shift of armor in the dark. You realize it's not just your tent alive with restless men. The camp itself never truly sleeps. Someone always has to be awake, watching the fire, watching the horizon, watching for the flicker of an enemy torch or the shadow of a raider slipping close. This is guard rotation, the rhythm of the night, and you are part of it whether you want to be or not. One firm historical fact is that medieval armies divided the night into watches, assigning men to stay awake in turns while others slept. The number of watches varied, sometimes 3, sometimes 4, depending on the commander's discipline. Chroniclers from the 100 Years' War mention the first watch and the last watch, the latter always the most dreaded because it meant dragging yourself from thin sleep into the coldest, darkest hours before dawn. Without these rotations, a camp could be taken completely by surprise. Fires smothered, soldiers slaughtered in their beds. And here's a quirky tidbit. Guards often carried not just weapons, but little wooden clappers or horns, devices meant to scare away intruders or keep themselves from dozing. Imagine trudging around a frozen camp, stamping your boots to keep blood flowing, and occasionally banging 2 sticks together like a one-man percussion band just so your eyelids don't betray you. Some guards sang low songs under their breath, repeating verses endlessly like lullabies twisted into wakefulness. But historians still argue over just how strict these watches really were. Some accounts describe iron discipline with men punished severely for sleeping on duty. Others suggest rotations were lax, especially in smaller campaigns, with guards nodding off and relying on dogs or sheer luck to raise alarms. Was guard duty a hardened system of survival or a fragile hope that someone would be awake at the right moment? The truth, as usual, probably lies between those extremes. You imagine yourself now, roused from your half-sleep, cloak pulled around your shoulders as you stumble out of the tent. The air outside slaps your face sharp and icy. Your breath bursts into the night like smoke. The fire has burned low, embers glowing faintly, sending up just enough light to make shadows dance across the clustered tents. You take your spear, cold metal, colder wood, and begin the slow patrol around the camp's perimeter. The ground crunches beneath your boots. Every few steps you pause, listening, straining to hear beyond the groan of the wind and the occasional snore drifting from tents. Somewhere a horse stamps and whickers, shaking its mane against the cold. Your toes ache, your knees stiffen, but you keep moving because stillness is death. You glance at the fire every few minutes, making sure it hasn't sunk too low. If it does, you'll have to toss on more wood, though you know the supply dwindles faster than anyone admits. The camp at night has its own music. Canvas flaps rustle. Men cough in unison like some strange choir. The fire pops, sending up sparks. Beyond that is silence, deep and endless. The kind of silence that makes you aware of how fragile you are under this wide sky. You peer into the darkness, half expecting to see glowing eyes staring back, though usually there is nothing. Still, your mind plays tricks and every shadow becomes a threat. You circle back toward the tents, and as you pass, you hear voices. Two men whispering in their sleep, dreaming aloud. One mutters a woman's name. Another curses as though fighting invisible foes. You glance inside and see bodies shifting under cloaks. A pile of exhausted forms that depend on you to keep the night at bay. The weight of it presses heavy. You stamp your boots again, trying to remind yourself that wakefulness is your only duty now. Some nights the rotation drags like a lean chain. You count stars. You recite prayers. You mutter verses. You barely remember anything to stay awake. Other nights, the cold itself is enough to keep your eyes open, biting you every time your lids droop. You think about how many generations of soldiers before you did the same. Shuffled in the dark, cursed the frost, begged for dawn. This rhythm is ancient, stretching back farther than memory. Eventually, another soldier relieves you. His cloak is wrapped tight. His eyes blurry and he nods without speaking. You hand him the spear, mutter something about the fire and slip back into your tent. The warmth is relative. It feels like stepping into a steaming bath compared to the frozen air outside. You curl back into your spot, limbs stiff but grateful, cloak wrapped around your shoulders again. You realize, drifting into sleep once more, that the guard rotation is not just about watching for enemies. It is about keeping the fire alive, keeping the rhythm of the camp steady, keeping fear from overwhelming everyone at once. Without it, nights would collapse into chaos. With it, the camp breathes, even when most of its men are deep in dreams. You don't remember falling back asleep after your turn on watch, but you do remember the voices. They weave in and out of your half-dreams, soft like lullabies, yet rough with exhaustion. A man to your left hums a fragment of a song. The words lost, only the tune carried in low vibrations that buzz through the canvas walls. Another whispers a prayer, muttering the same phrase over and over until it blends into the rhythm of your breathing. It's a strange comfort that you are never truly alone in this tent, even when your eyes close. One straightforward historical fact is that medieval soldiers often sang together at night, both to pass the time and to raise morale. Chronicles from campaigns in France and the Holy Land describe men gathering around fires, chanting psalms or bawdy ballads, depending on who was listening. These songs weren't just entertainment. They were a shield against despair, a way of reminding one another that voices could rise above the cold. Here's a quirky tidbit. Soldiers sometimes mumbled their way into sleep by reciting food recipes aloud. A kind of culinary lullaby. Imagine lying on a frozen ground, teeth chattering, and hearing your tent mate whisper about roasting geese, thick stews, or pies dripping with fat. The absurdity of it kept men chuckling long enough to forget, for a few moments, the misery gnawing at their bones. Some even claimed that naming dishes warded off hunger pangs, as if words alone could fill empty stomachs. And still, scholars debate what role this nightly chatter played. Some argue it was a conscious attempt to build solidarity, creating bonds through shared stories and songs. Others suggest it was simply nervous noise, a way of drowning out the silence that might otherwise remind men how close death lingered. Was it fellowship or was it fear? The records hint at both, leaving us with an echo that's difficult to pin down. You turn in your cloak, listening as the sounds swell and fade. A snore joins the chorus, heavy and guttural, while another voice whispers a love song so quietly you can't tell if it's meant for the group or only for his memory. You think of the crackling fire outside, the wind battering the canvas, and realize that inside this thin-walled shelter, the voices are another kind of insulation. Not physical warmth, but a fragile psychological heat that keeps despair at bay. The tent is alive with murmurs. Someone groans, someone laughs faintly. Someone curses under his breath. The words blur into one another, meaningless syllables mixing with the sounds of shuffling limbs and scratching. To a stranger it might sound like chaos, but to you it's a blanket. Every sound proves that life still pulses here, that men still breathe and dream despite the cold. You close your eyes tighter, letting the sounds carry you. The hum of a half-remembered hymn drifts above the low chuckle of a joke muttered in the corner. The two blend strangely well, sacred and profane, sharing the same space without conflict. You realize how many generations of soldiers before you probably heard the same soundtrack. A mixture of snores, songs, prayers, and curses wrapped together in smoky air. Picture it clearly. Men huddled under cloaks, faces shadowed, lips moving in half-conscious rhythm. One traces the sign of the cross repeatedly. Another mouths a boardy tale. Another hums through cracked lips. No one commands this chorus. It simply happens. Spontaneous and unplanned. Like the fire outside, the voices flicker, glow, and eventually sink into embers. And as you finally drift again, lulled by the strange mixture of song and sighs, you understand that this is how medieval soldiers carved space for themselves in unbearable nights. They could not chase the cold away, but they could feel the silence. The voices woven a net strong enough to hold back despair until morning. You blink awake in the middle of the night and realize with a dull kind of clarity that your sleep has been broken in two. First, you fell into heavy slumber soon after watch, lulled by the fire's fading glow and the murmurs of voices around you. Now, only a few hours later, you find yourself wide awake, staring at the dim canvas ceiling and listening to the sound of men stirring, coughing, and shifting in the dark. Feels strange. This interruption, like sleep, has been split neatly down the middle. One straightforward historical fact is that in the medieval world, segmented sleep was common. Scholars of pre-industrial life call it first sleep and second sleep. People would sleep for a few hours, wake naturally around midnight, and spend an hour or two talking, praying, tending fires, or even visiting neighbors before returning to rest. Soldiers, in tents, experienced the same rhythm, though for them it was shaped less by choice and more by necessity. The cold, the noise, and the constant demands of watch duty carved their nights into chunks. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some men claimed this midnight waking was the perfect time for storytelling, sharing eerie tales of ghosts and omens. Imagine lying in a smoky tent, eyes half open, while your neighbor whispers about spirits that wandered battlefields, about dead men who knocked on tent walls, or about saints who appeared in dreams to offer protection. It sounds like campfire folklore, but in the gloom it became almost believable. Some soldiers even swore they saw glowing figures near the fires at night, though whether that was spirits or just smoke playing tricks, you'll never know. And yet, historians still argue about whether segmented sleep was truly restful. Some say it was natural, the body attuned to cycles shaped by firelight and darkness. Others suggest it left soldiers perpetually exhausted, unable to recover fully before dawn forced them back to marching. Was broken sleep adaptive, or was it another cruelty piled onto weary bodies? The debate continues with no clear verdict beyond the fact that men somehow managed to endure it. You shift in your cloak, pulling it tighter, and listen around you. Voices stir again. Someone is praying softly. Words tumbling in Latin. Another groans and mutters, perhaps recounting a dream to a half-awake comrade. The man closest to you sigh heavily and whispers about food, fresh bread, roasted meat, anything but the stale crust that actually await him come morning. You can almost taste it, the imagined feast, even as your stomach growls in hollow protest. Outside, the fire has dwindled to embers, but you can see the faint glow through the tent seams. A guard passes, boots crunching in snow, spear but tapping the frozen ground in rhythm. Somewhere farther off, a horse whinnies softly, shaking frost from its mane. The world feels suspended, caught between deep night and the hint of dawn still far away. You realize this is a liminal time, a pause in the grinding routine of soldiering where men are neither fully awake nor fully asleep. You pull your cloak over your head, shutting out the draft, and drift into half-conscious thought. Perhaps this is when secrets are confessed, when men whisper about the families they left behind, about the fears they would never admit in daylight. Perhaps this is when curses spill more easily, aimed at commanders, enemies, or even God himself for allowing such misery. Words flow freer when half dreaming, when the mind is loose and unguarded. Imagine the tent as a hive of quiet activity. Some men slipping outside to relieve themselves in the snow, others poking at the fire, others whispering stories that blur fact and fable. The canvas walls glow faintly with the light of coals. Shadows bending and stretching as men move. It is both eerie and intimate, a time when exhaustion mingles with strange alertness. Eventually the rhythm shifts again. Voices fade, movements slow. Men roll back into their cloaks, pulling hoods over their heads, and gradually the snores return one by one until the tent hums again with the sound of second sleep. You feel your eyelids droop, your body sagging into the earth. And though the cold bites, it cannot stop the tide of drowsiness. As you surrender again to slumber, you realize that medieval soldiers didn't just fight enemies on the battlefield. They fought the structure of the night itself, the broken rhythm, the constant interruptions, the uneasy balance between wakefulness and rest. And yet, just as you do now, they found ways to close their eyes again and slip back into the dark, trusting that the second sleep might be enough to carry them through the dawn. You wake again, not to the itch of lice or the howl of the wind, but to the steady breathing of men packed close around you. In the dim light, you notice something that never fails to sting. Not all cloaks and bedding are created equal. The man across from you, a knight's retainer, shifts in his sleep wrapped in thick wool layered with fur, while you lie on rough canvas and a hide that still smells faintly of goat. Rank doesn't vanish in the dark. It curls up beside you and snores in comfort while you shiver. One clear historical fact is that the quality of sleeping gear varied enormously between knights and common foot soldiers. Wealthier men could afford lined cloaks, feather-stuffed pallets, or fine blankets carted along by servants. Chronicles describe nobles sleeping beneath embroidered pavilions, complete with rugs and pillows. Meanwhile, the rank and file had little more than their own cloaks, some straw, and perhaps a single blanket shared between two or three. Comfort became just another privilege of class. Here's a quirky tidbit. During certain campaigns, knights insisted on bringing brightly colored bedding into the field, red, blue, or even patterned with their family crests. It wasn't just for comfort, it was for display. Imagine staggering half dead from cold, and then catching sight of a nobleman's tent glowing with silks, as if a festival pavilion had landed in a sea of misery. It was equal parts infuriating and absurd, like bringing a feather bed to sleep beside a battlefield. But historians still debate how wide the gulf truly was. Some argue that knights' tents were genuine sanctuaries warmed with rugs and layered bedding, while foot soldiers barely survived the night. Others suggest the gap wasn't as vast, since supply shortages often reduced even nobles to rough improvisations. Were knights consistently insulated from hardship, or did campaigns grind everyone down equally in the end? The evidence is muddied, shaped by bias in who did the writing, nobles themselves. You glance again at your tent mate's furs and feel a mix of envy and resignation. The fur glistens faintly in the firelight leaking through the flap, while your own cloak smells of smoke and damp. Your neighbor snores softly, wrapped in comfort that might as well be another world away. Around you, other men shift restlessly, tugging their thinner cloaks tighter. Some mutter in their sleep, teeth chattering even while unconscious. The smells in the tent mark the divide too. The night's bedding carries a faint fragrance of herbs or oils, something his servants probably rubbed in to mask the musk of fur. Yours reeks of sweat, grease, and stale ale. You can almost taste the difference in the air. The inequality is not just felt in warmth. It seeps into every sense. Picture the camp as dawn approaches. Pavilions of nobles standing tall and richly dyed, straw-stuffed lean-tos sagging nearby. The contrast is stark, even grotesque. A visitor might mistake the field for a strange village where a carnival tent rose beside a havel. Yet in truth, both stand side by side because war pressed all classes into the same mud, though never on the same terms. You roll over, pulling your cloak tighter, and remind yourself that survival is not measured by softness. Comfort doesn't always guarantee endurance. Sometimes the man with fewer blankets learns faster how to huddle, how to endure, how to cling to scraps of warmth. You breathe in the smoky, sour air. Let the sounds of uneven breathing wash over you and drift back toward a thin, stubborn sleep. The night may dream in fur, but you dream in endurance, and tonight endurance is all you need. The fire outside has sunk low again, and when you wake, it is to the faint glow of embers. But something else catches your eye. A strange pot squatting by the tent's entrance. A clay vessel smudged black from repeated use. A faint warmth leaks from its sides. Someone has carried coals inside, banking them in a small brazier to keep the chill at bay. One reliable historical fact is that soldiers sometimes used improvised stoves, clay pots, or metal braziers filled with coals to heat their tents. Archaeological digs in Europe and the Near East have uncovered scorched potch and metal fragments in camp layers. Evidence of these makeshift heaters. Chroniclers mention them too, describing vessels of fire carried into shelters to smolder beside weary men. They were risky, but they offered something even a cloak or hide could not. Steady warmth against the night. Here's a quirky tidbit. Soldiers sometimes dropped herbs or pine needles into the embers, not just for the faint aroma, but to keep away biting insects. Imagine the irony of lying half frozen, inhaling the scent of smoldering rosemary while still scratching at lice. The smell mixed strangely with smoke and sweat, creating an atmosphere halfway between a battlefield and a kitchen. Some even swore certain herbs warded off evil spirits, so a glowing pot served double duty. Heater and supernatural shield. But historians still argue whether these braziers were common or rare luxuries. Some claim only officers could afford such contraptions, while ordinary men relied solely on body heat. Others point to evidence that even humble camps produced countless pots, suggesting they were widespread improvisations. Were these stoves a privilege of rank, or simply the invention of desperate men with a little clay and fire? The debate glows as fitfully as the embers themselves. You inch closer to the pot, stretching your hands toward its gentle warmth. The heat isn't strong, but in the drafty tent, it feels miraculous. You can almost imagine sleeping with comfort instead of clenched teeth. Your palms tingle, your face softens, and for a brief moment, the cold retreats around you. Others stir awake, eyes glinting in the faint glow. One mutters that the smoke stings his throat. Another coughs harshly, but no one moves it away. Risk of choking or not, no one wants to surrender that precious heat. The pot hums softly as the coals settle, sending up thin wisps of smoke that crawl along the canvas roof. The air grows thicker, hazier. You cough lightly, then pull your cloak tighter, trying to shield your nose, but still you lean close, drawn to the warmth. Even as your eyes sting, comfort always comes with a price here. Picture the tent now. Cloaks draped over shoulders, men crouched around a tiny brazier like monks around a relic. The coals glow red, faces lit from below, shadows twisting across rough canvas. Feels both holy and dangerous. Life given in embers, death lurking in smoke. You wonder if you will wake with a headache, throat roar from inhaling fumes. Yet you also know you will wake alive, and that outweighs everything. As you lie back again, cloak wrapped tight, you feel the warmth radiating across the tent, uneven but real. It is not enough to banish the cold, but it blunts its teeth. The pot of coals sits steady by the entrance. Guardian and threat in one, and as your eyelids sag once more, you realize this was the paradox of medieval survival. Every comfort, fire, drink, furs, even coals carried its shadow. Safety was never free. You wake again, stiff in every joint. And this time, you notice the way your body feels heavier than the night before. It isn't just the cold pressing down on you. It's the sheer weight of the clothing you never take off. Your quilted gambeson, the padded armor you wear beneath steel, lies wadded beside you like a discarded mattress. You realize you've been using it as a makeshift cushion to dull the hardness of the frozen earth. One straightforward historical fact is that soldiers frequently used their armor padding as bedding. A gambeson was more than just battlefield protection. It was a thick quilted garment stuffed with layers of linen or wool, sometimes as heavy as 20. Stripped from the body at night, it doubled as a mattress or blanket. Some chronicles even describe knights propping helmets under their heads like lumpy pillows, transforming tools of war into fragile comforts. Here's a quirky tidbit. Soldiers sometimes joked that the gambeson was warmer dead than alive. What they meant was that lying on it felt better than wearing it during a march. On the march, it trapped sweat and heat until it felt like a furnace. But laid out flat on the earth, it became an almost luxurious padding. Some men swore they slept better with their gambeson under their backs than on feather mattresses at home. Though whether that was truth or desperation talking, who can say? And yet, historians still argue about just how practical this practice was. Some suggest gambesons offered genuine insulation, thick enough to shield men from frost and damp. Others counter that once sweat-soaked and stiff, they provided little more than a barrier against mud. Was the gambeson a lifesaver at night or just another damp rag dragged from battlefield to camp? The sources leave us with a riddle stitched in linen. You lie back now, feeling the uneven quilting under your spine. Some spots bulge, some sag, but compared to the bare ground, it is paradise. The damp chill still seeps upward, but at least your bones don't grind against frozen earth. You tuck your cloak tighter around your shoulders, breathing in the faint stench of sweat that clings to the fabric. The smell is sour, musky, unmistakably human. This gambeson has absorbed days of labor, battle, and fear. It reeks of endurance. Around you, others do the same. A man lies with his gambeson pulled half over him like a blanket. Another sprawls directly on his breastplate as if it were a bedboard. One young soldier curls with his helmet against his chest, as if hugging a hard, cold child. You can hear the faint scrape of metal whenever someone shifts, armor clinking like an orchestra of rust. The tent fills with the mixed scent of wool, sweat, and iron. It isn't pleasant, but it is familiar. Your nose adjusts and soon the smell becomes background, almost reassuring in its constancy. You close your eyes, imagining the quilted layers beneath you as feathers instead of rags. The fabric scratches your skin through your tunic, but you tell yourself it's soft because that's the only way you'll rest. Picture the scene clearly. Gambesons spread like patchwork mattresses, their seams torn from battles, their stuffing poking out like tufts of hair. Cloaks thrown on top form uneven piles of bedding. Helmets glint faintly in the dim light. some pressed into service as pillows, others stacked neatly in corners. The entire tent looks like a jumble of war gear reimagined as furniture. And as you let your body sink into this strange mattress, you realize the irony. Everything designed to harm swords, armor, helmets becomes at night a tool for survival. War makes even padding sacred because it is the only thing between you and the earth's frozen bite. You close your eyes, hands folded on your chest, and drift into shallow, uneasy rest, grateful for the softness that isn't really soft at all. You wake with a start, nose wrinkling before your eyes even open. It's not the cold this time, it's the smell. A tent packed with men is never fragrant, but after nights of smoke, sweat, and damp wool, the odor becomes its own living thing. You breathe in cautiously and it clings to your lungs. Sharp smoke from half-burned wood, sour sweat soaked deep into cloaks, the wet dog scent of damp wool, and underneath it all the faint but undeniable tang of something singed as if the stew pot boiled over and scorched the bottom. One firm historical fact is that medieval camps chroniclers often mention the stench before they describe the bravery of knights or the misery of marches. Fires burned constantly, soaking canvas and clothing in acrid smoke. Tents trapped moisture, turning wool and linen into mildewed sponges. Add in the fact that soldiers rarely bathed on campaign, and you begin to understand why the smell of camp was a phrase that needed no explanation. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some commanders ordered herbs scattered on tent floors to mask odor. Soldiers crushed lavender, rosemary, or thyme beneath their boots, pretending it freshened the air. Imagine lying on straw laced with thyme, the scent briefly sharp before it faded under the stronger perfume of sweat. In some regions, men carried little pouches of dried herbs around their necks, not out of elegance, but as a desperate attempt to breathe something other than smoke. And yet, historians still puzzle over how much the stench mattered. Some argue it was so constant that soldiers stopped noticing, their noses numbed by weeks of foulness. Others suggest it carried real consequences, spreading disease by attracting flies and fouling the air. Was it just unpleasant, or was it another invisible enemy wearing men down? The evidence doesn't give us certainty, only scattered descriptions of soldiers gagging at their own cloaks. You shift uncomfortably, tugging the fabric closer to your face, and the smell intensifies. Wool damp with sweat and smoke, rough against your cheek. You cough softly, your throat roar from breathing stale air all night. Around you, other men groan awake, their voices thick and hoarse. One sneezes loudly, shaking the tent flap. Another mutters a curse at the reek, though he knows nothing can change it. The smells swirl together like layers of misery. Smoke coats your tongue, metallic and bitter. Sweat clings sour and oily to your nostrils. Wet wool smells almost animal. A reminder that your cloak once walked on four legs before it wrapped around you. Somewhere nearby, leather boots give off their own rancoda, half scorched by fire, half rotting from damp. And over it all lies the faint charred note of last night's stew, where beans fused stubbornly to the bottom of a pot. You roll over, trying to bury your nose in the cleaner folds of your cloak, but there is no escape. The air is thick, heavy, pressing against your senses. Even your dreams smell of smoke. You think of home, of fresh rushes strewn on floors, of clean sheets washed in river water, and the memory stings sharper than the stench itself. The reek is unpleasant, yes, but silence and clean air would mean something worse, an empty tent. You breathe in again, coughing, and let the foulness settle in your chest like another layer of armor. As you close your eyes once more, you realize the medieval camp was as much about enduring sensations as enduring enemies. Cold, smoke, damp, itch, and smell, all constant companions, all reminders of how survival is measured, not in comfort but in persistence. And tonight, persistence is the only fragrance you can wear. You're half asleep when you hear it first. A soft tapping sound like fingers drumming against canvas. Then comes the unmistakable chill seeping through seams. Rain or worse snow finding every gap, dripping onto faces already weary from the cold. The tent, which at times feels like a fragile refuge, now becomes its own enemy, funneling the storm inside. You roll over and feel drops splash against your cheek, icy enough to jolt you upright. From surviving accounts, we know that medieval tents were notoriously leaky. Heavy canvas and linen offered shade and modest shelter, but once saturated with rain or snow, the fibers sagged and wept. Chronicles describe soldiers waking in puddles, cloaks soaked, straw bedding ruined overnight. In one campaign in Flanders, entire groups abandoned their shelters after storms, preferring open air by the fire to the misery of dripping walls. There's also an odd custom worth mentioning. Some soldiers tried to waterproof tents with mixtures of animal fat or tar. The result wasn't perfect. Water still seeped in, but it left the canvas greasy to the touch, smelling faintly of rancid lard. You can imagine ducking inside only to be greeted by slick, sticky fabric that stained your hands and clothing. It might have kept a little rain off, but it also meant sleeping in a shelter that smelled like a butcher's shop. Interpretations differ on how soldiers truly endured prolonged downpours. Some historians suggest they rotated constantly, sending men to cut new straw to replace what had turned to mush. Others argue the misery simply had to be tolerated. Men slept wet, woke shivering, and marched on in sodden gear. Was there any effective system for keeping dry, or was survival simply a matter of stubborn endurance? The sources give conflicting glimpses but no tidy answers. You curl tighter under your cloak, but the wet sneaks in anyway. The wool holds some warmth, even damp, but it clings to your skin with a clammy grip. The ground beneath you has become soft mud, oozing upward as though the earth itself is swallowing you. Around you, men mutter curses, shift their bedding, shove cloaks against leaks. One man groans as drops fall steadily on his forehead, refusing to shift no matter how he turns. The smell in the tent intensifies. Wet wool carries a sour barnyard scent. Leather grows sharp and pungent when soaked. Smoke from the fire outside mingles with the damp, creating a heavy odor that presses down on your lungs. You cough, and so does the man beside you. Each breath puffing pale mist into the dark. Picture the scene. The canvas walls sagging, strewn with rivulets of water, straw mats sinking into sludge, cloaks wrapped like shells around shivering bodies. The fire outside hisses as rain spits onto embers, sending up little clouds of steam. The night is alive, not with voices now, but with the constant drip, 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 a rhythm of discomfort that seeps into every dream. Yet there's something strangely unifying in the misery. Men who moments before grumbled at each other now laugh grimly at their shared fate. One soldier jokes that he'll grow gills by morning. Another swears the water dripping onto him is holy. A baptism for sins unspoken. Laughter rattles through the tent, weak but genuine. In that moment, humor becomes its own blanket, covering the damp bodies with a fragile warmth. You pull your cloak tighter and close your eyes again, knowing the storm will not end simply because you wish it. Drops will fall, boots will stay sodden, bedding will stink, and in the morning armor will be heavier than ever. But somehow you also know you'll stand up anyway, stiff and miserable, ready to march through mud. The tent may leak, the ground may suck at your feet, but the routine will carry you forward. And that more than dryness or warmth is the true shield against freezing to death, the refusal to stop. The storm passes, but the night never feels entirely safe. You lie there listening to the rain fade into silence, only for another sound to take its place, a faint clinking like charms brushing against one another. When you lift your head, you notice the strange shapes dangling from the tent poles. Little pouches, wooden crosses, bones tied with string. They aren't decorations. They're defenses of another kind, woven not from wool or wood, but from belief. Contemporary writings remind us that superstition seeped into every layer of medieval soldiering, and sleep was no exception. Men pinned amulets inside their cloaks, hung charms on tent ropes, and carved symbols into wooden poles, hoping to keep evil at bay while they lay vulnerable in the dark. Some wore saint medals, others clutched relics no bigger than a splinter, claiming it was a fragment of a holy shrine. The line between faith and survival blurred in every smoky shelter. And then there were the stranger habits. Soldiers in Eastern Europe sometimes tied small animal skulls to their tents, convinced they warded off frost demons or wandering spirits. Others sprinkled holy water or whatever passed for it around the tent's edge like an invisible fence. You can picture a weary man fumbling for his flask, shaking a few drops onto the muddy ground, muttering half-remembered prayers. It's less about certainty than about comfort. The scholarly debate lingers over how much of this was true religious practice versus simple folk superstition. Some experts insist the charms reflected sincere devotion, extensions of the same faith that drove men to crusade or pilgrimage. Others argue it was more instinct than doctrine. Primitive gestures against fear, no different than knocking on wood. Were the soldiers protecting their souls or just distracting themselves from the howling wind? The records give us fragments but no clear verdict. You stretch out your hand and touch the charm dangling closest to you. It's a scrap of cloth tied into a knot, stiff with grease, smelling faintly of smoke. Maybe it once held herbs, maybe a token from a wife or child, now reduced to a talisman in this wet camp. The man who hung it believes it matters. And as you lie beneath it, you realize it matters to you too, if only because it reminds you of the world beyond war. Around you, men whisper in half-sleep, prayers tumbling with curses. One soldier crosses himself repeatedly, muttering the names of saints. Another strokes a wooden token, thumb rubbing it smooth with habit. Someone else snores loudly, oblivious, either too exhausted or too faithless to join in. The tent becomes a strange chapel of sorts. Its congregation sprawled on damp ground, its hymns mumbled, its relics improvised. The air carries not just the stench of wet wool, but the faint sweetness of herbs crushed into charms, lavender perhaps, or thyme. You inhale, and for a fleeting moment, the tent smells almost like a hearth at home. Then another draft pushes through and the illusion fades. Still you cling to it. Picture the canvas lit faintly by coals, shadowy shapes of charms swaying, pendants brushing the fabric, crosses glinting in dim glow, soldiers' faces gleam with sweat and soot, eyes half closed, yet darting toward these talismans as if to check they're still in place. Outside, the wind rattles the ropes, but inside you feel the fragile comfort of belief strung like thread between each man. You close your eyes again, hands still brushing the little knot of cloth. Perhaps it does nothing. Perhaps it holds no power at all. But belief itself is power. And in the cold night, when everything else feels hostile, even scraps of superstition can feel like a shield. You breathe deeply, clutching the thought like a blanket, and drift again into uneasy rest, protected not by walls or warmth, but by faith, yours or someone else's. It hardly matters. You wake to the feeling of something warm pressing against your side. Not another soldier this time, but something softer, furrier. You turn slightly and find the camp dog curled tightly against you, nose tucked into its tail, breath puffing in quiet huffs. It has crept in during the night, choosing your corner of the tent as its refuge. For a moment, the cold fades, and all you feel is the steady pulse of heat radiating from its small body. Chroniclers often note that animals wandered freely through medieval camps, and dogs were the most common companions. They scavenged scraps, guarded supplies, and followed soldiers as if tied by invisible leash. When the nights grew cold, these animals weren't shooed away. They were welcomed, sharing warmth with their human companions. The presence of a dog was more than comfort. It was a practical survival tool, a living heater on four legs. And here's a curious glimpse from the margins of history. Some soldiers gave dogs honorary roles in camp life, calling them mascots or guardians. One source from a Burgundian campaign tells of a mutt nicknamed Captain, who slept in the commander's tent and barked loudly enough to rouse men when an enemy scout approached. Another account speaks of dogs being wrapped in spare cloaks during sieges, their warmth treasured as much as their loyalty. Yet experts remain divided on whether this bond was common or exceptional. Some argue that dogs were everywhere, indispensable companions to lonely soldiers. Others suggest their role was exaggerated, that animals were more nuisance than aid, spreading fleas and stealing food. Was the dog a beloved comrade in arms, or just another hungry mouth in a camp already stretched thin? The truth, as ever, is muddied. You stroke the animal's fur, coarse yet comforting. It smells faintly of smoke and meat scraps like everything else in camp, but its warmth is undeniable. You can feel the steady thump of its heartbeat, faster than yours, steady as a drum. The dog sighs deeply, pressing closer as if it knows the bargain. It gives heat, and in return it receives shelter. Around you, other men notice. One grumbles jealously, muttering that you've stolen the best blanket in camp. Another chuckles softly, calling the dog wiser than most soldiers for finding the warmest spot. A third tosses a scrap of bread across the tent, which the animal snaps up without lifting its head. In that dim space, the dog becomes something more than just an animal. It becomes a bridge uniting tired men in shared amusement. The smells of the tent are softened slightly by the dog's presence. Oddly enough, the musky scent of fur blends with the wool, almost masking the harsher tang of sweat and smoke. You inhale and for a moment imagine a hearth, a village home, a life where warmth is given freely, not clawed from the night. Picture the scene. The dog curled in a tight circle, soldiers hunched under cloaks, eyes half shut, all sharing the same fragile cocoon of heat. The canvas walls ripple in the wind, but inside the animal's presence anchors the group. It is a small reminder that not everything in war is bleak. Even in the coldest night, loyalty can curl up beside you and keep you alive. You close your eyes, hand resting on the dog's flank, feeling its chest rise and fall, its warmth seeps into your bones, steady and quiet. Perhaps it is no miracle, just body heat shared like any other. But in the middle of a freezing campaign, it feels miraculous. You let your breathing fall into rhythm with the animal. And slowly you drift back into a sleep that feels deeper than the rest. As though survival tonight has come with a wagging tail and a quiet sigh. Morning never seems to come quickly enough, but tonight you find yourself awake not from cold or itch, but from silence. The dog has shifted away. The fire outside has sunk low, and within the tent the usual chorus of mutters and snores has faded. There is only stillness, broken now and again by the snap of canvas as wind claws at the ropes. It takes you a moment to realize why. The commanders have ordered quiet. No songs, no chatter, no prayers muttered too loudly, just silence, heavy and deliberate. Documents from military ordinances show that discipline often extended even into the night. Soldiers were warned against making noise, not only to keep order, but also to prevent enemy scouts from detecting the camp. Silence was a tool of survival imposed as firmly as any ration or drill. A rowdy camp might comfort its men, but it also betrayed its position. Quiet tents meant safer soldiers, though the price was a suffocating hush that weighed on every ear. And yet odd exceptions existed. Some armies developed codes of whispered signals, clicks of the tongue, small knocks against shields that let men communicate without raising voices. Imagine lying awake, hearing not a word, but the faint tap-tap that meant all clear, or the hiss that meant trouble. These tiny noises became the lullabies of discipline. Reminders that silence did not mean neglect, but vigilance. Interpretations vary over how strictly such rules were followed. Some historians argue commanders enforced silence with brutal punishments, lashing men who laughed too loudly. Others believe that outside of campaigns near enemy lines, soldiers ignored the order and filled their tents with noise anyway. Was this hush universal or just an ideal scribes wanted readers to believe? The reality may have shifted with every commander and every night. You lie there listening to the absence of sound. No snoring, no coughing, no whispered songs. The tent feels different without them, almost eerie. Your own heartbeat becomes loud in your ears. The dog stirs quietly, tail brushing the ground, and even that feels like a shout in the stillness. You turn, trying not to rustle your cloak, but the faint scrape of fabric seems amplified, sharp as a blade against stone. The air is heavy with the weight of unspoken words. Men breathe carefully, shallowly, as if even the act of living might break the rule. You imagine their eyes open in the dark, each man aware of the others, none daring to speak. It is a peculiar kind of intimacy stripped of chatter, reduced to the simple fact of shared breathing. Smell fills the gap where sound has been silenced. Smoke lingers like a blanket. Wool dampness clings sharp and earthy, and leather gives off its sour tang. In the absence of voices, your senses sharpen toward these odor. As if the tent itself wants to remind you that silence cannot erase discomfort. Picture the camp from above. Dark mounds of tents huddled together. No songs rising, no laughter spilling out. The only sound is the wind combing through guy ropes and the occasional crack of wood in a fire smothered to embers. To an outsider, it would look like a graveyard rather than a living camp. Each tent a tombstone under moonlight. And yet there is power in the quiet. You sense the discipline binding you together. Invisible but strong. In silence, men learn to endure not just cold but also stillness. They lie with thoughts unspoken, fears unsaid, prayers whispered only inside their minds. It is a different kind of survival, not by warmth, but by restraint. As you curl back into your cloak, the hush presses in, but you let it settle. Your eyelids droop. Your body stiffens, and you drift not into the noisy half-dreams of other nights, but into a deeper, more disciplined sleep. The silence holds you like an iron frame, unyielding but steady, carrying you toward dawn. When dawn creeps across the horizon, it brings little warmth. The fire outside has sunk to ash. The dog has slipped away to scavenge scraps, and you notice something different in the tent. A blanket of mismatched colors spread across two men. At first you think it's their own, but no, its weave is finer. Its dyes deeper, the fabric softer than anything issued to common soldiers. Then you realize what it is. Spoils. Someone has looted it. Maybe from a village yesterday. Maybe from a noble's baggage train. Chronicles from campaigns repeatedly mention the way soldiers scavenged bedding and blankets from conquered towns. Pillows, quilts, and rugs taken from homes ended up in muddy tents, draped across weary bodies that cared nothing for their origins. One account of the sack of Basir describes knights dragging silken sheets into their pavilions while foot soldiers stuffed their tents with woolen mattresses ripped from peasants' beds. War turned household comforts into survival gear, and sometimes the results were almost laughable. Men slept beneath embroidered hangings meant for church altars, or wrapped themselves in curtains hastily cut from noble halls. Imagine curling up under cloth once blessed for mass, now stinking of smoke in a soldier's tent, or a peasant's ragged quilt stuffed hastily with extra straw, passed off as a luxury because it kept out drafts. Modern historians disagree on just how widespread this practice was. Some argue it was common because armies relied heavily on plunder for supplies. When food was taken, so were linens. Others caution that chroniclers exaggerated, focusing on gaudy stories of nobles and silk, while most soldiers still froze under plain cloaks. Was looted bedding an everyday sight, or a rare stroke of luck? The truth remains uncertain, woven in scraps of evidence like the fabric itself. You shift and run your hand along the edge of the blanket near you. It feels smoother than your own cloak, the threads tight, the dye still visible even in dim light. The men sharing it sigh with relief in their sleep, their bodies tucked together under this stolen warmth. Their faces look younger, softer, as if comfort has peeled away a few years of suffering. Around the tent, others notice too. One man eyes the blanket jealously, tugging his own threadbare cloak tighter. Another spits softly, muttering that loot never falls to the poor. Yet no one moves to take it away. In this cold, to tear away warmth is almost a crime against survival itself. The blanket stays, its origins forgotten, its purpose now reduced to one thing only, keeping soldiers alive. The smell lingers differently around the looted fabric. Unlike wool reeking of smoke and sweat, it carries a faint sweetness, perhaps lavender or rose water, once soaked into it in some forgotten chamber. The scent is faint now, barely clinging, but enough to remind you this blanket once belonged in a world of softer lives. The contrast is sharp, fine fabric crumpled into mud, delicate threads serving as shields against brutal cold. Picture the tent as the first light filters in a patchwork of survival. One man wrapped in looted velvet, another curled on a rough pelt, another shivering beneath only his cloak. Helmets and gambesons lie scattered, doubled as pillows and mattresses. The blanket draped across two men stands out like a jewel dropped in the mud, a reminder of plunder's strange role in keeping armies moving. You close your eyes again, imagining how many soldiers before you slept under someone else's treasure. Curtains, rugs, altar cloths, all torn from their rightful places to become bedding in the dark. War doesn't just take lives. It steals comfort and transforms it. Tonight, you sleep among fragments of other people's homes, stitched awkwardly into your own fragile survival. The stolen blanket does not reach you, so you shift back onto your corner of straw. It crackles faintly as you move, dry stalks snapping beneath your weight. The sound is strangely reassuring. At least it means the straw hasn't yet grown damp. You run your hand across it, feeling the rough ends prick your skin, and realize that for all its scratchiness, it is better than lying directly on the frozen ground. Records from medieval armies make it clear that straw was a standard form of bedding whenever possible. Bundles were cut from nearby fields, hauled into tents, and spread beneath cloaks as crude insulation. Chroniclers note that during long sieges, entire wagon loads of straw were requisitioned specifically for bedding. Without it, the earth leached heat too quickly, and men woke stiff, shivering, sometimes even with their hair frozen to the ground. And yet there were creative twists. Some soldiers stuffed straw into sacks, sewing the top shut to make rough mattresses. Others scattered rushes or dried reeds, layering them carefully so the sharp ends pointed downward. Archaeological evidence even suggests that in some regions straw was replaced with bracken or pine needles, chosen because they released pleasant scents when crushed. Imagine the irony, your tent reeking of smoke and sweat, but your bedding releasing a faint woodland fragrance each time you shifted. Specialists still debate how effective straw truly was. Some argue it provided excellent insulation if replaced often, trapping pockets of air between stalks. Others point out that once damp, straw became useless, molding quickly and attracting vermin. Was straw a genuine comfort or merely a temporary illusion of one? The truth seems to depend entirely on how often soldiers were allowed to refresh it, which in war was never often enough. You stretch your legs and feel the uneven padding beneath you. Some stalks poke sharply, others cushion your joints. The texture shifts constantly, never truly soft, but just enough to dull the ache of the earth. Around you, men shift in their own straw beds, each pile uneven, some reduced to handfuls after nights of trampling. One man mutters as he plucks a stalk from under his cloak, rubbing it between his fingers like a talisman before tossing it aside. The smell of straw fills the tent, dry, dusty, faintly sweet. It mingles with the harsher odor until for a moment the tent smells almost like a barn. You breathe it in and think of stables, of animals bedded down, warm and safe, and envy them. Horses with their deep straw stalls might be more comfortable than the men meant to ride them. Picture the tent carefully. Cloaks sprawled on uneven piles of straw. Boots lined up along the flap. Gambersons tossed carelessly at top rushes. The straw glows faintly golden in the thin morning light, a rare brightness against the gloom. Bits cling to clothing, sticking in hair and beards, leaving men looking as though they've sprouted dry whiskers overnight. No one bothers to brush it off anymore. It has become part of camp life. Another layer of discomfort so familiar it no longer draws complaint. You curl onto your side, cheek pressed against the brittle stalks. They scratch but also support you, keeping your face from touching the cold mud. You sigh, grateful for even this thin barrier. Straw isn't luxury, not by any measure, but it is enough. And in the world of tents and cold nights, enough is the closest thing you will ever find to comfort. Morning comes harshly, not with warmth, but with a deeper kind of cold that seems to have crept into your very bones while you slept. You open your eyes and see your breath clouding before you like smoke from a dying fire. The tent walls are stiff with frost, the canvas crackling when touched, each seam outlined in white crystals. You shift your cloak and realize it too has frozen where it absorbed last night's damp, stiff as a plank, bending reluctantly as you move. Sources from winter campaigns tell us that frozen mornings were one of the worst orals for medieval soldiers. Chroniclers describe tents coated in rime, ropes snapping when pulled taut, and armor that had to be pried apart before it could be worn. Even horses stood coated in frost, their breath rising like steam in the pale dawn. Surviving such mornings demanded not strength of arms, but sheer persistence, the ability to force a frozen body into motion. And there are stranger accounts, almost humorous if they weren't so miserable. Men sometimes woke to find their beards frozen into their cloaks, locked in place by ice crystals. Others discovered boots stiff enough to stand upright without feet inside, transformed overnight into grotesque statues. Picture stumbling from your tent, shaking a boot like a block of wood, cursing as you tried to soften the leather near the fire. Scholarly opinions diverge on how much these icy conditions actually crippled armies. Some argue entire campaigns stalled because frost made armor unusable and roads impossible. Others suggest soldiers simply endured, their movements slower but still relentless. Were frozen mornings catastrophic or just another misery among many? The evidence is too inconsistent to settle it completely. You sit up slowly, cloak crackling as you pull it from your shoulders. Your fingers ache, stiff and clumsy, fumbling with the frozen ties of your tunic. Around you, the tent stirs with groans and curses. One man shakes his straw bedding, sending up a faint shower of frost. Another rubs his hands furiously, blowing into them, muttering prayers through chattering teeth. Everyone looks older in this light, their faces gray and hollowed, their eyes squinting against the pale sun that promises no warmth. The smells of camp shift in the frost. Smoke hangs sharp and acrid, fresher than before, as if even the fire struggles to burn in this air. The usual stench of sweat is muted, replaced by the clean bite of cold, though beneath it lingers the faint sourness of damp wool stiffened into ice. You draw a long breath, your lungs stinging, and cough against the rawness of frozen air. You picture yourself crawling toward the tent flap. Outside, the ground gleams silver, every blade of grass rimmed in frost. Armor lies scattered, helmets and breastplates glazed with a thin layer of ice. so cold they reflect the morning light. Horses stamp and snort, their nostrils steaming. Fires struggle. Men crouched low to coax embers back to life with trembling hands. It looks less like an army than a field of statues slowly thawing. You force yourself to your feet, every joint stiff, every movement reluctant. Your boots are hard, leather cracking faintly as you walk. You lift a gauntlet from the ground and nearly drop it, shocked by how bitterly it bites into your skin. The metal feels more weapon than armor in this state, wounding the wearer before the enemy even arrives. You blow into it, rub it with your cloak, try anything to soften its cruel chill around you. Others wage the same small battles, warming swords by the fire, tugging stiff straps into place, shaking frost from cloaks. No one speaks much. The cold steals words as surely as it steals heat. The only sounds are the crack of ice breaking, the hiss of breath, the dull groans of men pushing themselves upright. And yet, even in this misery, life continues. Someone manages a joke about statues coming to life, and a ripple of weak laughter passes through the camp. Another soldier, desperate, sets his frozen boots too close to the flames, and they smoke furiously, drawing curses and jeers. These moments of absurdity puncture the silence. Proof that men can still laugh even when their teeth chatter. You pull your cloak tighter and stare at the pale sun as it climbs reluctantly into the sky. It offers light but no warmth, painting the frost in glittering patterns that almost look beautiful if beauty could coexist with numb fingers and aching lungs. You sigh, shoulders heavy, and prepare for another day. Frozen mornings may stiffen armor and crack cloaks, but they cannot stop the march. And that realization, bitter as it feels, is the only warmth you will carry until night falls again. The frozen dawn has only just begun when the order comes. March. You groan with the others, dragging your stiff body upright, wrapping your cloak tightly before stepping out into the brittle air. Every movement feels like it belongs to someone else, as if your joints are hinges rusted shut. The ground crunches underfoot, crusted with frost. Each step a reminder that warmth is still hours away if it comes at all. Chroniclers repeatedly note that medieval armies rarely enjoyed the luxury of resting in camp for long. After a freezing night, soldiers were expected to lift themselves and march onward, armor clanking, tents packed, wagons creaking forward. There are descriptions of men barely able to bend their legs, hobbling like old men as commanders barked them into columns. Endurance wasn't just about surviving the night. It was about rising again at dawn and moving no matter how broken the body felt. And then there's the stranger side of it. Accounts describe men deliberately rubbing snow on their faces in the morning to shock themselves awake. The logic was brutal but effective. The sting of ice in your eyes and cheeks forced blood to flow, jolting the body into motion. Imagine stumbling from your tent, half dead with fatigue, and scooping a handful of snow to slap across your face. It sounds like torture, but it was better than collapsing before the march even began. Experts disagree about how soldiers truly managed these daily orals. Some argue the sheer rhythm of war orders shouted, drums beating, columns forming dragged men into motion, whether they wanted it or not. Others claim soldiers often lagged behind, straggling on roads with commanders constantly berating them to keep up. Was morning discipline truly ironclad, or was it more chaotic than chronicles admit? The truth is probably both. Rigid in theory, ragged in practice. You shoulder your bundle, the weight of cloak and gambeson pressing heavily, and join the shuffle of boots leaving camp. The fire is left to smolder. The dog trots at the column's edge and the tents collapse behind you. Frost crackling as canvas folds. The air smells sharper out here, filled with cold earth and smoke that clings to your hair. Breath rises from hundreds of men at once, steaming like fog above the line of march. Your feet ache with each step. The boots, still damp from days past, rub against raw skin. Every soldier you pass limps slightly, their bodies stiff from sleeping half frozen. Yet the sound of movement builds. Hundreds of boots crunching, armor groaning, voices muttering. It becomes a rhythm dragging you forward. Each step pulling you farther from rest, yet closer to whatever awaits. The march feels endless. You look ahead and see nothing but cloaks hunched against the wind, spears bobbing like stalks of dead grass. Behind you, the same sight stretches to the horizon. Occasionally, a horse snorts, hooves striking frost-hard soil, reminding you that even the animals suffer. Your stomach growls, your throat burns from dry air, but still you walk. And here is where the absurdity creeps in. Men joke even now. One soldier shouts that his legs have turned to frozen logs. Another replies that at least logs burn warmer. Laughter trickles down the line, weak but real. Someone begins humming a tune off key, dragging, but others join. Voices weaving into the crunch of boots. The song is not joyful, but it carries you. The landscape passes slowly. Each mile a blur of frostbitten trees, gray sky, and pale earth. Your cloak flaps stiffly, edges frozen in jagged waves. You glance at your comrades and see their faces pale, lips cracked, eyes red-rimmed from cold wind, yet their jaws are set. The march is misery, but it is also motion, and motion means survival. By the time the sun climbs, weak and watery, you have walked for hours. Your body no longer feels entirely your own, numb feet, aching shoulders, a back bent beneath layers. But strangely, the numbness becomes its own armor. Pain dulls, replaced by rhythm. Left foot, right foot, breath in, breath out. The world narrows to this cycle, repeated until it becomes almost meditative. And as you walk, you realize this is the secret of surviving medieval campaigns. Not just enduring the cold night, but enduring the frozen morning after. When every instinct begs you to lie down and never rise again, instead you rise. You walk. You let the rhythm carry you forward, even when you feel like ice inside. By midday, the march has carried you into a different landscape, though the cold clings stubbornly. You notice, however, that not every army faced the same kind of misery. Soldiers from different corners of Europe brought their own traditions of fabrics and winter gear. Each suited or sometimes poorly suited to the climates they knew best. Lying in your tent again that night, you think about how survival looked very different depending on where you came from. Surviving records show clear regional contrasts. In Northern Europe, wool dominated everything. Thick cloaks, layered hoods, even mittens stitched from felted scraps. Chroniclers in Flanders described men cocooned in wool so dense that snow slid from their shoulders like water. Meanwhile, soldiers from southern lands often struggled when forced into northern winters. Their lighter linen garments, perfect for Mediterranean breezes, became liabilities in sleet and ice. Some even froze, unaccustomed to nights when the ground itself turned to stone. And there were peculiar improvisations too. Men from colder regions sometimes stuffed their boots with moss or sheep's wool, a trick passed down from shepherds. In contrast, Italians on campaign in the Alps were noted for layering spare shirts beneath their armor, building warmth not without air cloaks, but with multiple thin fabrics. Imagine peeling off 5 damp linen shirts at dawn, each one heavier with frost, each one still clung to because even frozen linen was better than nothing at all. Specialists today disagree on whether these regional practices actually mattered in the field. Some argue cultural clothing traditions gave soldiers a real advantage in alien climates. Scots and Norsemen, for instance, enduring damp winters more easily than soldiers from warmer coasts. Others believe once men were on campaign, everyone suffered equally. Wet wool is wet wool, no matter what corner of Europe you came from. Did fabric traditions truly shape survival, or were they quickly erased by mud and frost? The debate remains unsettled. You lie back and think about your own cloak, thick but itchy, smelling of smoke. You imagine men elsewhere under cloaks dyed bright red or green or trimmed with fur. Some were heirlooms passed down through families, their wearers believing the fabric carried the strength of ancestors. Others were stolen, looted from villages. Their origins erased the moment they were wrapped around a shivering body. In war, identity of cloth didn't matter as much as whether it kept the wind off. The tent fills with variety, even among your own comrades. One soldier beside you wears a cloak patched with leather, the seams stiff and shiny. Another clings to a blanket striped with colors, clearly woven in a different land. A third wraps himself in layers so thick he looks almost like a mound of cloth with no man inside. The diversity of fabrics creates a patchwork inside the dim shelter. Each square telling a different story of where the men came from and what they carried into this frozen campaign. The smells too shift with the fabrics. Wool smells heavy and sour when wet. Linen sharp and grassy. Fur musky and animal-like. Together they create an atmosphere that is oddly regional, like a map of Europe recreated in odor rather than borders. You breathe it in and feel as though you are surrounded not just by soldiers, but by an entire continent squeezed into a single tent. Picture the camp as seen from above. Tents scattered across frost, each filled with men wrapped in their own traditions of cloth. To one side, soldiers huddle under bright Flemish wool. To another, men tug lighter cloaks from Spain tightly around their shoulders. Some make do with nothing but patched tunics while others burrow under fur as soft as velvet. The battlefield erases nationality, but at night, when cold presses hardest, every stitch of fabric becomes a reminder of where you were born. You close your eyes, tugging your cloak tighter, and realize that survival tonight is stitched not just from wool and straw, but from culture itself. You are warmed or frozen by the choices of weavers, tailor, and traditions that came long before you. And though tomorrow you will march again beside men from distant lands, tonight you share their struggle, wrapped together in the patchwork quilt of Europe's fabrics. The frost has barely left the ground when you realize the next ordeal is worse than an open march. A siege, a camp outside city walls is no temporary stop, no fleeting misery of 1 or 2 nights. It is weeks, even months of waiting in damp trenches and dripping tents, with the cold pressing down harder every day. Here, the tent becomes less a shelter than a cage, trapping soldiers in cycles of smoke, wet earth, and endless boredom. Medieval chronicles tell us that sieges dragged on through bitter winters, forcing men to sleep in fields churned into mud and slush. Soldiers dug shallow trenches, pitched tents on makeshift platforms, and prayed their shelters would withstand storms. Accounts from the siege of Torre in 1340 describe entire rows of tents collapsing under heavy snow. Men dragging themselves out half-frozen only to crawl back beneath sagging canvas. Unlike marching campaigns, there was no escape in movement, just endless nights of waiting for hunger and weather to break the enemy first. Some of the coping measures bordered on absurd. Soldiers at certain sieges built raised wooden pallets inside tents, laying cloaks and hides across them like crude bunk beds, anything to keep above the flooded ground. Others spread straw so thick it piled knee-high, only for it to rot into a swamp after days of rain. Imagine the stench, wet straw, mold, and sweat fermenting together until the air itself seemed poisonous. Researchers differ on how sustainable siege living really was. Some argue men endured surprisingly well, sustained by supply trains and communal fires. Others insist attrition from cold, illness, and filth was the true weapon of sieges, killing more soldiers than arrows. Were tents in these conditions genuine shelters, or just symbols of routine in an environment already lost to misery? The evidence points in both directions depending on who survived to tell the tale. You picture yourself huddled in such a tent, listening to Rainimer canvas night after night. The ropes creak, the poles bow, water seeps in no matter how you patch the seams. Your cloak clings damply to your shoulders, and the straw beneath you has turned into black sludge. You shift in your sleep and every movement squelches. It's not just uncomfortable, it feels suffocating, as though the earth itself is swallowing you. The smells intensify until they are unbearable. Acrid smoke caught beneath the tent flap, mold from rotting straw, sweat trapped in damp wool. Add to that the reek of unwashed bodies crammed into too small a space, and you understand why men grew sick so quickly. Coughs echo in the night, rattling chests like drums of disease. The tent meant to guard life becomes a chamber where fever spreads faster than fire. Picture the camp outside. Lines of tents sagging under frost. Trenches filled with brackish water. Soldiers stumbling with buckets to throw it out only to see more seep in. Fires smoke stubbornly, refusing to burn properly in damp wood. Horses stand huddled, ribs showing, their breath steaming into the gray air. From the walls above, defenders watch, knowing time and weather are already allies. And yet, even here, men improvise. Some carve charms into tent poles, believing symbols of saints will hold the canvas upright. Others cluster in larger tents, cooling heat and laughter, telling stories to drown the sound of dripping water. You hear one man boast that he once slept dry for 3 nights straight, thanks to a fur cloak looted from a merchant, while another jokes bitterly that he'd trade his sword for a straw mattress that didn't rot beneath him. As you close your eyes again, listening to the wind howl across trenches, you realize that siege life was as much a battle with the elements as with enemies. Every night became an act of stubborn resistance. To lie in a leaking tent, to breathe in the stink of rot, and still to wake and endure another day. Survival wasn't measured in victories, but in the sheer will to keep living through the slow, icy grind of time. The cold that gnaws at you in northern winters is one thing, but there's another kind of cold that catches men by surprise, the desert night. You might imagine sand and heat, the glare of the sun baking the day into misery. But when darkness falls, the warmth vanishes as if stolen by invisible hands. A chill sweeps over the camp, sharper for its contrast to the blistering hours before. Men who marched all day with sweat pouring down their backs now find themselves shivering under a canopy of stars. Accounts from crusading armies in the Levant, as well as chronicles of Moorish campaigns in Spain, describe how soldiers struggled with these brutal swings in temperature. Cloaks soaked with sweat during the day hardened like boards at night, trapping dampness against skin. Fires became difficult to maintain because dry desert winds devoured sparks, and would had to be scavenged or traded at high cost. What seemed like a land of blazing sun turned treacherous once the moon rose, and there were peculiar improvisations worth remembering. Soldiers often dug shallow pits in the sand, laying inside and covering themselves with cloaks, so the earth itself served as insulation. Others slept beneath their shields, turning curved metal or wood into a roof against the cold wind. Some men even claimed that burying their feet in warm sand before nightfall kept them comfortable until dawn, a trick that worked only if the desert held the day's heat long enough. Scholars remain divided on whether these methods truly helped. Some point to records of men freezing to death during desert campaigns, evidence that improvisations fell short. Others argue that the very survival of armies in such climates proves these tactics must have been at least somewhat effective. Were soldiers enduring or merely gambling each night on luck? The answer is buried as unevenly as their makeshift beds. You imagine yourself lying in such a tent, its canvas straining against hot winds that suddenly turn icy. Sand creeps into every seam, filling your boots, grinding between your teeth. The stars above seem endless, sharp as frost themselves, their beauty mocking your shivering body. Your cloak clings stiff with dried sweat, the smell pungent, sour, intensified by the dry air. Around you, men cough hoarsely, their throats roar from dust, their voices brittle as parchment. The silence of the desert night is different from northern winds. Here there is no rustle of trees, No patter of rain, only vast emptiness broken by the occasional bark of a jackal or the cry of some night bird. Every sound feels magnified, footsteps crunching sand, the hiss of a tent rope shifting, the pop of a coal refusing to die. You pull your cloak tighter, but the cold slithers under it like a snake, finding every gap. Picture the camp from above. Tents huddled like dark shells scattered across pale dunes. Each one glowing faintly from within as men cluster around braziers of scavenged wood. Horses stand tethered, their bodies hunched, their breaths fogging the dry night air. The fires flicker weakly, their lights swallowed by the immensity of the desert. From a distance, the army looks like a handful of fireflies trapped in an endless sea of sand. Despite the misery, laughter still trickles through the tents. One soldier jokes that he preferred the snow of home to this cursed land where you sweat and freeze in the same day. Another mutters that at least here lice die quicker in the dry air, and the tent bursts briefly with laughter. Survival again is stitched not only with cloaks and fires, but with humor, the last defense against despair. You close your eyes. The sand scratching against your cheek. The stars glaring overhead. The cold still seeps into your bones. But you tell yourself, the dawn will come. The sun will rise. And once again heat will return. That cycle, burning days and freezing nights, becomes its own rhythm, as steady and punishing as the marches of northern frost. And in that rhythm somehow soldiers endure. The desert night leaves its mark. But so too do the endless winters, and eventually the body begins to show the price of these campaigns. You wake one morning and realize the cough you heard in the tent last week has not gone away. It has multiplied. Men hack and wee in the dark, their chests rattling as though gravel has been poured inside. You touch your own throat, roar from smoke and frost, and understand that sickness is as constant a companion as your cloak. Surviving letters and chronicles reveal how disease became inseparable from cold nights in camp. Pneumonia, fevers, and frostbite spread faster than arrows. Even minor chills could turn deadly when men slept damp night after night. One commander in the Baltic lamented that more soldiers were buried by ice and coughs than by enemy swords. It was a truth every army knew but could not escape. Cold weakened bodies and weakness invited sickness. And there were the stranger details, the things soldiers did to cure themselves. Some drank warm ale mixed with garlic, swearing it banished chills. Others wrapped hot stones in cloth and pressed them to their chests, hoping the heat would chase coughs away. A few even placed slices of onion in their boots, convinced the fumes traveled upward to cleanse their lungs. Imagine the stink in a tent where smoke, sweat, and onions mingled into a suffocating haze. Modern researchers are divided on just how devastating cold-induced illness was. Some argue it decimated armies, accounting for the majority of casualties in certain winters. Others suggest soldiers hardened by lives already filled with exposure endured sickness better than we assume. Were camps truly graveyards of coughs? Or did men exaggerate their suffering in letters and chronicles? The debate continues, echoing like the coughs themselves. You lie back and listen to the symphony of illness around you. A man on your left hacks violently, spitting phlegm into the straw. Another groans, clutching his chest, whispering that his ribs feel like knives. Someone sneezes, wet and explosive, and curses immediately after. The sound is constant, layered over the crackle of the fire outside, and the whistle of wind through seams. The smell has changed too. Smoke and wool still dominate, but beneath them lies the sour tang of sickness, phlegm, sweat soaked with fever, the faint metallic scent of blood from cracked lips. You inhale reluctantly, each breath catching in your own chest. The tent feels smaller in this air, as though the illness itself has thickened the atmosphere. Picture the camp in this state. Men huddled, coughing into cloaks, faces pale in the dim glow. Some refuse to leave the fire, their bodies shaking violently even beside the coals. Horses stamp uneasily, as if aware the humans around them are faltering. From above, the camp looks the same, tents in rows, smoke drifting upward. But within each shelter, sickness gnaws silently. Still men find ways to joke. One soldier, coughing so hard he nearly collapses, mutters that at least his enemies will smell his breath and flee. Another wheezes out a song, each note broken by fits of coughing until laughter ripples weakly through the tent. Humor doesn't cure, but it loosens the grip of despair, if only for a moment. You wrap your cloak tighter, pressing it against your mouth as though it could filter the air. Your chest aches with each breath, but you tell yourself it's just smoke, just fatigue, not sickness. You close your eyes, though the coughing continues around you, filling the tent like a second kind of wind. And in that uneasy rest, you realize the truth that every medieval soldier knew. Survival was never just about keeping warm. It was about keeping illness at bay long enough to see another dawn. The coughs do not fade, but sleep still drags you under. And there in the dark you find yourself dreaming of warmth. Not real warmth, not fire or cloaks or furs, but the memory of it, the way a hearth once glowed at home, the smell of bread baking, the soft weight of a feather mattress. You wake for a moment and realize how cruel the mind can be. It gives you comfort in dreams, only to snatch it away when your eyes open to a damp tent and freezing breath. Writings from medieval soldiers, and those who chronicled them often mention dreams and visions in the night. Some men claimed they dreamed of banquets so vividly they woke tasting meat on their tongues. Others confessed that their mothers, wives, or sweethearts appeared in sleep, whispering words that carried them through the cold. In the harshest campaigns, these memories became stronger than reality. So much so that some men swore they could smell their home hearths through the stench of smoke and straw. And then there are the odd fragments of folklore that creep into records. Soldiers told stories of men who dreamed not of food or warmth, but of strange fires that never went out. Sacred flames said to follow armies, promising survival. Some believed these dreams were omens. Others insisted they were nothing more than the fevered visions of men half frozen. Imagine waking in the dark, certain you had been warmed by a divine fire, only to feel frostbite gnawing your toes. Modern scholars disagree about how much weight to give these dream accounts. Some treat them as exaggerations or literary flourishes by chroniclers eager to romanticize suffering. Others argue they reflect genuine psychological survival mechanisms, the brain conjuring warmth and abundance because the body lacked both. Were these dreams historical fact or just metaphors for endurance? The question lingers like the haze of smoke in a closed tent. You pull your cloak tighter, eyes closed, trying to summon your own memory of warmth. A fire from your childhood perhaps, or the heavy quilt you once hid under as a storm howled outside. But the harder you try, the more the present intrudes, the damp smell of wool, the ache in your joints, the cough rattling from the man beside you. Memory flickers but cannot hold back the chill. Around you, the tent stirs with murmured dreams spoken aloud. One man whispers about meat pies, his lips smacking in sleep. Another mutters the name of a woman over and over, voice breaking into a sob. Someone else shouts suddenly, jolted awake by a nightmare, then curses as others groan at the noise. Dreams weave through the tent as tangibly as smoke. Each man's mind creating its own fragile refuge. The air inside is thick, a blend of sweat, smoke, and the faint sweetness of straw now crushed beneath dozens of restless bodies. You breathe shallowly, half hoping the memory of warmth will linger on your tongue. You realize that what keeps men alive here is not just cloaks or fire, but the stubborn insistence on remembering what warmth feels like, even if it only comes in sleep. Picture the camp from a distance. A sprawl of tents under moonlight, each holding a dozen bodies dreaming of fires that don't exist. Outside, the ground glitters with frost. Inside, men twitch and murmur, clinging to illusions stronger than their rags. To any observer it looks like misery. To the men inside it is also survival. You close your eyes again, determined to hold on to some scrap of warmth, even if it's false. You let your mind wander to imagined firesides, to laughter at tables, to the glow of hearths. And though your body lies stiff and frozen on straw, your spirit floats for a moment in memory, borrowing comfort from a world far away. The dream fades, and when you open your eyes, you understand something that has been building all along. Survival in these tents has never been just about wool or fires or scraps of straw. It has always been about the will to keep going when the cold presses in from every side. You look around and see men still breathing, still stirring under their cloaks, and you realize endurance is as much mental as physical. Sources from medieval campaigns repeatedly stressed that morale was as vital as food or fuel. Commanders wrote that an army with warm cloaks but broken spirits could crumble faster than one half-starved but still laughing. Cold nights in tents tested not only the body's resilience but the mind's too. Men had to convince themselves each morning that survival was worth the effort. And sometimes they used unexpected methods. Accounts describe soldiers telling jokes so crude or absurd that men laughed until tears froze on their cheeks. Others sang lullabies from their childhoods, voices cracking but determined. Some even played simple games, tossing dice in the straw, scratching patterns into frost on the canvas walls. Anything to turn misery into routine. These small acts stitched the mental fabric that cloaks alone could not provide. There is still debate among historians about which mattered more, the physical strategies of survival or the psychological ones. Some argue no charm, no song, no memory could fight frostbite. Others insist it was precisely these fragile mental rituals that carried soldiers through, allowing them to rise at dawn and march again. Did men endure because their cloaks held or because their minds refused to break? The answer remains slippery, like smoke escaping through a tent seam. You pull your own cloak closer, not just against the cold, but as if shielding your thoughts around you. Bodies shift restlessly. One man snores loudly. Another mutters a prayer. Another groans in his sleep. The tent cacks under the wind's assault, but it still stands. You close your eyes and breathe deeply, inhaling smoke, wool, and dampness. None of it is pleasant, yet all of it proves you are still here. Picture the camp as dawn approaches one final time. Fires gutter, smoke drifting thin against pale light, horses stamp, their breath steaming. Men stumble out of tents, shoulders hunched, eyes red, armor stiff with frost. It looks like misery from afar, but up close it is a miracle. These men endured. They slept half frozen. They woke aching. And still they rise. And you realize lying there in your corner of straw that the true weapon against freezing to death has always been stubbornness. Cloaks tear, straw rots, fires sputter. But the will to keep moving step after step, night after night outlasts the cold. That is why medieval soldiers survived. Not because their tents were strong, but because their minds were stronger than frost. So now, as you let yourself drift into sleep, imagine the flickering glow of a medieval campfire fading into embers. The tents stand low and weary, their canvas patched and sagging. Yet still they shield weary bodies curled beneath cloaks. You can hear the rhythm of snores, the occasional cough, the murmur of a prayer whispered into the smoky dark. Outside, frost gathers silently on ropes and poles. But inside, men cling stubbornly to one another, to memories, to scraps of warmth. The story of how they slept, wrapped in wool, pressed against comrades, guarded by fragile fires and even by faith, tells us something deeper than just military history. It reminds us that survival is never about perfection. It is about finding enough warmth, enough laughter, enough belief to carry through the night. Every droplet that dripped through canvas, every flea that crawled across skin, Every icy gust that rattled a flap was another test. And yet dawn always came and the soldiers always rose. Tonight, as you lie beneath your own blankets, you might picture yourself in that tent. You can almost feel the rough wool scratching your cheek. Hear the canvas strain in the wind. Smell the smoke seeping into fabric. But you also feel the quiet determination that bound those men together. The refusal to yield to cold. The fragile courage of closing one's eyes and trusting morning to come. So let your breathing slow. Let your body sink deeper into softness. The cold and the noise belong to another time, another place. Far away from you. Now you are safe and the world outside can wait. Sleep like those soldiers once did, not in comfort but in endurance, knowing you have already made it through the hardest knot.